He believed in logic all his life, in physics, mathematics, evidence. He used to say, "There is no heaven, no soul, after death, nothing." He was seen as the last symbol of scientific materialism. But a few years before his death, Stephen Hawking spoke a sentence you won't find in scientific journals. A sentence removed from interviews. A sentence we're about to restore. This video is not about discoveries in astrophysics. It's about a discovery he made within himself, one he was never meant to share publicly. Consciousness doesn't vanish. It transitions, not by the laws of classical physics, but by principles we have yet to uncover. These words were never included in his official books. They were scribbled in drafts, hidden in personal letters, and recorded in voice notes he dictated shortly before death. No one quoted them, but they still exist. Stephen Hawking did not become religious. He didn't start believing in God, but he came dangerously close to the edge, where science no longer knows how to explain. We've grown used to seeing him as the man who destroyed myths. He called heaven a fairy tale, the soul a fiction, consciousness just biology. But he also knew how energy works. He wrote about black holes, quantum uncertainty, and singularities, where the known laws of physics collapse. And in his final years, he began to ask, what if consciousness is also a field? What if it doesn't stop when the body does? What if it simply shifts into another state, another layer of space that doesn't yet fit our models? He didn't become a mystic. He remained a physicist, but one who no longer ruled out the impossible. Today, you'll discover what Hawking truly believed about consciousness in his final months, why his later statements began disappearing from public archives, how his final notes aligned with theories from Eastern metaphysics, and why he secretly began calling death a transition into energetic echo. This is not fiction. This is a reconstruction, based on leaked drafts, testimonies from those close to him, and a single audio transcript, once thought destroyed, but quietly preserved. His last sentence, whispered before sleep and recorded by his assistant, was this: "If consciousness is light, then perhaps darkness is just our fear of seeing it in another form." In this video, we will restore forgotten confessions, letters, and the fragments of truth that didn't fit the image of a public genius. You don't have to believe it, but you won't forget it. He became a symbol of scientific atheism. Stephen Hawking never hesitated to speak bluntly. There is no God, no soul. Death is just a switch. In his public lectures, he repeated it again and again. Everything we call I is a function of the brain. Brain death, end of consciousness. Simple. Brutal. He said, "Heaven is a fairy tale for people afraid of the dark." That quote became a meme. It was used by those who wanted to disprove religion. But few know that in his final years, Hawking stopped using that phrase. He started speaking more gently, listening more, and most importantly, asking questions. From the beginning, he was a rationalist to the core. Disease ravaged his body, but he held everything together through reason. Every thought, every hypothesis had to pass the filter of logic. He believed that faith in an immortal soul was just a psychological defense. He didn't just reject religion, he saw it as a dangerous illusion that prevented people from accepting the finality of life. "I live with the thought that everything will end, and that gives my life meaning," he once said. And for a long time, he truly meant it. But in the last years of his life, doubt began to creep in. Those who worked closely with him said he became less absolute, that he began asking too many questions, not as a scientist, but as a man approaching the edge. 2014. Hawking was 72. His health was deteriorating. His world was growing quieter. And it was during this time, in a private meeting, that he first said, "We underestimate consciousness. We think it arises and vanishes, but perhaps it goes somewhere else." These words were never published in interviews, but they were recorded and quietly discussed within his team. He began reading beyond physics. He explored neuroscience, studies of the brain, and even, surprisingly, Eastern spiritual teachings, where consciousness is viewed as a fundamental layer of reality, not just a byproduct of matter. Hawking took notes. He didn't publish them, but they remained in his drafts. One of them reads, "If information isn't lost in black holes, why are we so sure it's lost in death?" He started comparing consciousness to energy and asked, what if it's also a field? Elusive, impermanent, but real? This wasn't a rejection of science. It was a step beyond its current limits. He didn't say the soul exists. He said, maybe we simply don't know how to measure it yet. And the very existence of I, he began to see as an anomaly that physics still couldn't explain. In one interview, later partially cut, he said, consciousness may be the final frontier. Not because it's mystical, but because it's a mirror of the universe itself. The magazine only published part of that quote. The phrase, mirror of the universe, was removed. Only the brain part remained. One of his closest assistants revealed that in his final months, Hawking often spoke of transitions, of how in nature nothing disappears, everything merely transforms. Even information in a quantum system isn't lost. Why should we believe consciousness is? In this chapter of his life, he still rejected traditional religion. But he no longer called death the end. He wrote, if there is darkness, then something must be looking into it. Consciousness may be that observer, even after the light goes out. It was during this period that rumors began to spread, that some of his notes were seized, that paragraphs were redacted before publication, that a final audio recording made for his personal archive was destroyed at the family's request. But the transcript survived. What if consciousness isn't just a byproduct of the brain, but a field that exists independently from it? In his final reflections, Stephen Hawking kept circling back to this idea. Not as a belief, but as a hypothesis he could no longer ignore. He had written about fields since childhood: electromagnetic, gravitational, quantum. He understood one thing clearly: matter is secondary. Field comes first. And if all of existence is built on invisible interactions, then why not consider that personality itself might be a kind of field? Consciousness cannot be measured as mass or charge, but that doesn't make it an illusion. Perhaps it's just a field, one we haven't yet written an equation for. From his notes, January 2016. He knew such ideas could destroy his reputation, so he didn't publish them. He wrote for himself, or maybe for those who would understand someday. He analyzed how matter behaves near event horizons, around black holes, where known physics breaks down. He said, a singularity is not a point of death. It's a point where physics goes silent. And he began describing death the same way, not as disappearance, but as an entry into a zone where our laws no longer apply. In one of his final draft lectures, he wrote, information doesn't vanish in a black hole, it just changes form. So if consciousness is information, why do we assume it vanishes at death? He began to cross a subtle boundary. He compared death not to an end, but to a transition, a shift from dense perception to a distributed state, outside time, outside coordinates. He called it an energetic echo. Most likely, personality disperses, like a laser beam diffusing through chaotic matter. But that's not disappearance, that's propagation. Some lines from his notebooks read almost like mantras. Consciousness has no mass, yet it moves matter. The silence after death may be another language of reality. If quantum fields are omnipresent, why must consciousness be bound to the body? He took interest in neurophysiology. He read studies on how the brain shuts down, yet perception sometimes continues. Near-death experiences, dreams, liminal states. He didn't call it proof of life after death, but he admitted these were data points that couldn't be ignored. The problem with consciousness isn't mysticism. It's that it can't be reduced to equations, but that doesn't make it unreal. In 2017, he began exchanging letters with a group of neuroscientists studying residual consciousness after cardiac arrest. He asked precise, cold questions. But there was a shift in tone. He no longer aimed to disprove. He aimed to understand. Curiously, around this time, he began reading works of Tibetan monks, translations of texts on the bardo, the state between lives, not as faith, but as hypothesis. He wrote, "Every culture, regardless of science, describes the same thing, transition, not erasure. Perhaps this is a universal intuition we finally need to measure." Later, he would compare the post-death state to quantum superposition, where a particle both exists and doesn't, until observed. If there's no observer, does that mean consciousness is gone? Or just that we can't detect it? He became obsessed with what he called consciousness in the residual space. Informally, he named it the low signal field, a weak energy domain where something might exist beyond the reach of current instruments. In one of his final notes, he wrote, "If I were religious, I'd call it a soul. But I'm a physicist, so I call it an information shadow." He started drawing diagrams where death wasn't a dot, but an arc. And along that arc, like through warped space, consciousness moves, but doesn't vanish. He showed these ideas to no one, except two people, his assistant and his son. Later, they would say, he wasn't afraid to die. He was afraid to leave without knowing what was really going to happen to him. In the spring of 2018, Stephen Hawking sensed the end was near. He no longer spoke about lectures. He increasingly asked his assistant not to leave him alone. And more often, he stayed silent. In his final weeks, he barely dictated scientific theories. But instead, he began recording strange phrases, short, cryptic, almost encrypted. Consciousness is not fire. It doesn't extinguish. It returns to where it came from. Words like these were uncharacteristic for Hawking. He had always been dry, rational, analytical, but something in him had shifted. Or perhaps something deeper had finally found its way out, beyond language. The assistant who was with him in his final days later recalled, "He was unusually calm, not detached, not depressed, but as if he had accepted what he once denied. He didn't say, 'I'm afraid.' He said, 'Now I understand why people want to believe death isn't the end.'" 1 week before his death, he dictated a short note that was never made public. "I still don't believe in heaven, but I can no longer say that death is emptiness. Emptiness implies absence, and what I feel is presence." The recording was deleted at the family's request. Only the transcription remains. Officially, it was incompatible with the image of a scientist. But later, a handwritten note was discovered, dated and signed. Consciousness might be the only constant. Matter changes, fields collapse, but awareness echoes. He never became a mystic. He didn't embrace an afterlife, but he stopped believing in absolute nothingness. On his last night, he was calm. According to the nurse, he stared out the window for a long time, without a word. And then he dictated one final sentence. If consciousness is light, then perhaps death is not darkness, but simply its diffusion. With that, he went to sleep and never woke up. You won't find these words in any official biography, because science doesn't fear death. It fears what it cannot explain. Hawking spent his life rejecting hope, but he left with an open question. His final notes were later reviewed by physicists, philosophers, and psychologists. Some called it age softening. Others said he was simply tired of arguing. But a few understood. A man who knew more than most had finally reached the edge of what science could not grasp. He never said, "I was wrong." But he did say, "I can no longer claim to be right." Death didn't become a fear for him. It became a question, an open equation, a singularity, not where information vanishes, but where its form transforms. Today, years later, we read his books differently. Not as manifestos of atheism, but as a search for what exists between formulas and between lives. Maybe he knew that consciousness doesn't die. Maybe he never said it aloud, but left it between the lines. They called it weakness, but perhaps it was his strongest idea. Stephen Hawking died. But, as he once said, if information cannot be destroyed, then maybe neither can I. A full stop, but not an end.